The first thing I heard when I walked into the combat hall that morning was laughter. Not the kind that makes you want to join in, the kind that has a target. I knew it was me before I even looked up. I had been the target for so long that I could feel it the way you feel cold air before a storm. My name is Eli Voss. I am 17 years old. I am human, and on this station, that last part is the only thing anyone ever remembers about me. The Galactic Confederation Academy sits in the outer ring of the Ceres belt, a station so large it has its own weather system in the lower decks. More than 4,000 cadets study here from 63 recognized species across the Confederation. I am one of 11 humans enrolled. The other 10 are on the diplomatic and science tracks. I am the only one in combat training. This fact alone has been the source of more conversations than I can count, most of which I was not supposed to hear. I took my seat on the far left bench of the lower observation row. The hall smelled like metal and the faint chemical sharpness of energy dampeners. The overhead lights were set to full brightness for the morning session, and under that light, every alien in the room looked exactly as intimidating as they were designed to be by millions of years of evolution. Drathians with their double-jointed limbs and reinforced bone plates, Saurians standing nearly 2 m tall, with reactive muscle tissue that could triple in density during combat stress. Eri with 4 arms and reaction speeds that made human reflexes look like something you might observe in a sleeping animal. And then there was me, 168 cm, 62 kg, unarmored skeleton, no passive healing factor, no enhanced senses, no natural weapon of any kind. I had heard the instructors describe my species twice in official briefings. First time, Commander Rithkas said with complete seriousness that humans were biologically unremarkable but politically necessary. The second time, a visiting assessor from the Confederation Medical Board reviewed my intake file and asked the registration officer if there had been a mistake. There had not been a mistake. I was exactly what I appeared to be. What no one on this station had bothered to figure out yet was what that actually meant. The morning session was a standard strength and speed evaluation, the kind the Academy ran every 3 weeks to update the combat standings board. The board was displayed on the main wall of the hall, visible to everyone. Updated in real time. I had been ranked last since the day I arrived, position 44 out of 44 in my cohort. There was a running joke among the Saurian cadets that the Academy had added a 45th position labeled floor just so I would have someone to beat. I had heard that joke 11 times. I had never responded to it once. That restraint was not weakness, it was information management. The evaluation began with the standard protocol. Each cadet was called forward in reverse standing order, meaning I went first. I stood on the assessment platform, a circular pad in the center of the hall, while the sensor array above it read every biological marker it could detect: heart rate, muscle fiber density, bone stress tolerance, nervous system response time. The machine hummed for 6 seconds and then displayed my results on the board beside my name. The number next to reaction speed drew short burst of laughter from the Saurian group near the back. I did not turn around. I stepped off the platform and returned to my bench. What the board showed was accurate. My reaction speed was the slowest in the cohort by significant margin. My strength output was at the bottom. My projected combat endurance based on standard biological modeling ranked me below every other cadet present. The sensors were working perfectly. They were just measuring the wrong things. Here is what the sensors did not measure. They did not measure the 14 months I had spent in the station's digital archive reading every piece of available research on saurian skeletal anatomy. They did not measure the fact that I had identified, cross-referenced, and memorized the location of 11 distinct nerve cluster points in the Sorthian body where concentrated pressure causes involuntary motor shutdown. They did not measure the 340 hours I had logged in the lower training bay between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning when no one else was there, working on precision rather than power. They did not measure my grandmother's voice in the back of my head. Her name was Carol Voss. She had been a trauma surgeon for 31 years in a hospital that served one of the most difficult neighborhoods in a difficult city on a difficult planet. She was small like me. She had never been physically strong by any standard measure. She had also never lost a patient she believed she could save, and she had kept that record by doing one thing better than anyone around her. She understood systems. Every living body is a system. She used to tell me when I was small and sitting in her kitchen, watching her hands move with that quiet precision that made everything she touched look easy. Systems have inputs, processes, and failure points. If you understand the failure points, you don't need to be the biggest force in the room. You just need to apply the right amount of pressure to the right location at the right time. I had taken that lesson and turned it into a science. I had files on every cadet in my cohort, not personal files, not anything inappropriate, biological and behavioral files built entirely from observation and publicly available academic research. I knew that Drathians experienced a toucan processing lag when a threat appeared from their lower left quadrant due to structural gap in their peripheral nerve routing. I knew that Ioni, despite their 4 arms, had a predictable strike pattern when cornered because their secondary arms were dominant and always initiated before their primary arms could override. I knew that saurians, for all their density and power, had been documented in peer-reviewed Confederation medical literature as having a specific pressure point behind the lateral knee joint, where a concentrated impact of 42 kg of force delivered at an upward angle of 17 degrees caused immediate involuntary leg collapse. 42 kg. I could generate that. I had been generating it precisely and repeatedly for 7 months. None of this was visible on the assessment board. The board showed numbers that made the room laugh. I let them laugh. Information management. After the evaluations, the cohort moved into the briefing chamber for the day's instruction segment. Commander VTHKA stood at the front, tall and angular in the way of all Drathians, his uniform pressed into geometric perfection. He had the kind of authority that came not from volume but from complete certainty in his own correctness. He was by every official measure an excellent officer and an excellent instructor. He was also, in my private assessment, person who had never once in his career been seriously surprised. That was going to be a problem for him. He announced the squad challenge Exercise with the flat efficiency of someone describing a maintenance schedule. The format was simple, pairs, and small groups would be assigned opponents and given a contained arena. Scenario, performance would be evaluated on technique, adaptability, and outcome. The results would factor into end-after term standings. Then he looked at me, not quickly, not accidentally. He looked at me the way you look at something you are about to use as an example. Cadet Voss, he said. And the room went quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when something embarrassing is about to happen to someone specific. Will serve as the baseline control subject for this exercise, given the wide variation in physical capability within this cohort. It is useful to have a fixed lower reference point. I expect Cadet Voss to disengage within the first 60 seconds of any assigned match. 60 seconds, he said it like a generous estimate. I wrote it down in my personal log that evening, not because it hurt, because it was data. He had told me exactly what he expected, which meant he had told me exactly what would surprise him. I had been waiting for a moment like this since the day I arrived, not out of anger, not out of a need to prove anything to anyone watching. I had been waiting because I had done the preparation, and preparation without application is just knowledge sitting a room with nowhere to go. That night, after the session ended and the other cadets went to the mess hall, I went to the lower training bay. I ran my usual sequence, precise movements, controlled breathing, pressure point targeting on the practice dummies the academy had set to soar the in resistance levels. I did not rush. I did not push past my limits. I worked exactly within them, sharply and carefully, the way my grandmother had worked with her hands in that kitchen, making hard things look like nothing at all. When I finished, I sat on the floor of the empty bay and ate the protein bar I had brought in my pocket. The station lights outside the small high window had shifted to their night cycle, a dim blue that made everything look like the bottom of a very calm ocean. I thought about Commander Rathaz's face when he said 60 seconds. I thought about what 64 seconds would feel like in comparison. Then I put the wrapper in my pocket, stood up and went asleep. I slept very well. The morning the challenge was announced publicly, I was already awake. I had been awake since 4, which was normal for me. The lower training bay at that hour belongs only to the machines and the hum of the station's recycling processors, and whatever small, stubborn piece of a person refuses to rest until it has done everything it set out to do. I had spent 2 hours on footwork, not dramatic high-speed footwork, precise, weight-controlled footwork, the kind that lets you be exactly where you intend to be when the moment arrives, rather than where momentum carried you. I showered, dressed, and arrived at the main hall before any other cadet in my cohort. I took my usual seat on the left bench. I placed my log on my knee and reviewed my notes on Sorley and physiology one more time, not because I had forgotten anything, because revision is discipline, and discipline is the only edge that does not depend on biology. Caldron arrived with his group. If you have never seen a Saurian at full presence, it is difficult to explain the effect. They do not simply walk into a room, they occupy it. Caldron was the largest cadet in the cohort, first in the standings, and the kind of person who understood this about himself in a way that had become part of his posture, his voice, the angle of his head. He was not cruel in the way that requires malice. He was cruel in the easier, more common way, which is simply never having had a reason to consider what it feels like to be on the other side of that. Much physical certainty. He had 4 cadets with him, or in a Drathian fast, and technically precise, Sauna another. Saurian, slightly lighter than Caldron, but quicker. Theo a Ravani whose 4 arms moved in constant low-level motion. Even at rest, a nervous energy that read as readiness. And Brix, a Drathian who had scored 2nd overall in the last speed evaluation, and who I had noted moved with an unusual right side bias, always planting his dominant foot a half step earlier than standard form required. I had files on all of them. Khan walked to the center of the floor, which was not where cadets typically stood when the session had not yet begun, and he stood there until the room oriented toward him. It took about 4 seconds. He had done this before. I want to make a formal challenge request, he said, and his voice carried easily to every corner. He was addressing the room, not Commander VKA, not the training officers. The room, individual combat scenario, open arena. I want Cadet Voss. The room made a sound, not laughter this time, something more uncertain than that, which was actually more interesting to me. Laughter. I understood. Uncertainty meant the room was not sure what to do with the image of Caldron choosing me specifically. It should have been obvious. I was the lowest ranked cadet. Choosing me was a statement, not a contest. He was not looking for a fight. He was looking for a demonstration. Every head turned to me. I looked at Caldron. I held the look for 2 full seconds, which is longer than it sounds when a room is completely silent. Then I said, accepted. 1 word, no volume, no performance. Just the words spoken clearly. Caldron blinked. It was very brief, barely visible, but I saw it because I was looking for it. He had expected hesitation, maybe a refusal, maybe a look toward the instructors for help. He had not expected the word to come back that fast and that flat. Commander VKA processed the exchange from the front of the room and formally logged the challenge in the session record. He asked if I understood the format. I confirmed that I did. He asked if I wanted to request a postponement for preparation. I said no. The match was scheduled for the following morning. After the session ended, Caldron's group went to the mess hall and were loud about it. I heard them from the corridor. Specific predictions, specific timelines, specific descriptions of what a Saurian impact at full muscle density does to a human rib cage. They were not entirely wrong about the physics. They were wrong about the conclusion. I ate alone at a corner table on the far side of the hall. I had a bowl of the grain mixture that tasted like nothing but had the caloric profile I needed, and I reviewed my notes one last time. Not the combat notes, the notes I kept on behavior, the observations I had made over months about how each cadet in the cohort responded to unexpected situations. Khan escalated when surprised. This was in the data. 3 prior evaluation matches, all against opponents smaller than himself, and in each one, the moment the opponent did something outside his expected pattern, his response time increased and his technique loosened. He was trained for victory. He was not trained for confusion. None of them were. I finished my food, put my log in my bag, and stood up. Cadet Theon was sitting 2 tables away. A Iravani who had been in my cohort since the beginning and who had never spoken to me directly, but who I had noticed on several occasions watching me, not with mockery, with something quieter. I did not know what to make of it, and so I had filed it as an observation without a conclusion, which was the honest category for it. He was watching me again now. I met his eyes, briefly, nodded once in the neutral way. You nod at someone whose intentions you respect, even without understanding them, and left the hall. I went to bed at 9:00. The match was at 7 the next morning. I had done everything I could do. Preparation without rest is just exhaustion wearing the costume of effort, and my grandmother had told me that too. I set my alarm. I closed my eyes. The station's night cycle hummed outside my window. Somewhere in the upper halls I could still hear Caldron's group, still loud, still certain. I let the sound fade and found the quiet underneath it, the quiet where everything I had learned and practiced and memorized lived in perfect patient order, waiting for morning. The arena was smaller than the main combat hall, contained space with a flat composite floor and sensor arrays mounted in all 4 upper corners. It recorded everything: force output, movement vectors, biological stress indicators, technique scoring. Every motion I made would be measured and logged. That was fine. That was good. Actually, I wanted a record. 41 cadets were present in the observation area. I had not expected that many. The challenge had apparently traveled further than the mess hall conversation from the night before. I recognized faces from other cohorts, older cadets who had no reason to be here at 7 in the morning, except that someone had told them something interesting was going to happen. They were right, just not in the way they thought. I stood on my side of the arena floor in my standard issue training gear, no added equipment, no protective bracing. I had been offered the standard impact dampening vest that the academy provided for evaluation matches, and I had declined it, not out of arrogance. The vest would limit my shoulder rotation by 11 degrees, and I needed full rotation for 2 of the 4 techniques I intended to use. Krun entered from the opposite side. He had his squad with him at the boundary line, not in the arena, just present, a visible support structure. He was wearing impact bracing on his forearms and upper torso, standard for Saurian cadets in open format matches. He looked at me the way you look at a problem that is already solved. Commander of Rithka stood at the scoring station. He went through the standard protocol, rules of engagement, scoring criteria, yield conditions. He read them with the tone of someone who has read the same document many times and finds it adequate. When he finished, he looked at me once, and in that look I saw something I recognized: pity, the kind that is not unkind but is completely, fundamentally wrong in its assumptions. Begin, he said. Caldron moved immediately. That was expected. Saurians open with forward pressure. It is instinct before it is strategy. He crossed half the arena in 4 long strides, building momentum, arms forward, body angled for control. Impact designed to drive a smaller opponent directly into the floor. I did not dodge. Dodging would have put me outside his reach temporarily, but given him the initiative for the follow-up. Instead, I moved forward inside his expected engagement range, and at the point where his forward momentum was fully committed, but his arms had not Yet closed, I placed both hands at the precise spot I had memorized behind his left knee and drove upward at 17 degrees with 63 kg of concentrated force. His leg buckled, he went down on that side, and the momentum that had been his advantage became a problem because there was nowhere for it to go except into the floor. He hit hard. The sensor array registered a significant impact. The observation area was completely silent. I stepped back to center floor and waited. It took 3 seconds to process what had happened, 2 more to get upright. He was not seriously hurt. That had not been the intention. The intention had been a clear, undeniable demonstration of a principle, and that principle was now logged in the sensor record for the entire observation area. To see, he came again, this time more carefully, more controlled, better, genuinely better than the first approach, and I noted that with honest respect. He adjusted. That was not nothing but adjusting to what you think happened is different from adjusting to what is actually coming, and what was coming had been planned before he stepped into this arena. The second exchange lasted 9 seconds, the third lasted 4. By the fourth, his squad stepped forward to the boundary line, which was within the rules of the format for a multi-charger open scenario, and I heard Commander Vrethka acknowledge the format shift in a voice that had lost most of its flatness and gained something I had not heard from him before: uncertainty. The squad entered one at a time in practical terms because the arena was not wide enough for a coordinated multi-body approach without creating the exact spacing vulnerabilities I had already mapped. Oren came in from the left. I knew his lower left quadrant lag. I used it. Sana was faster than I had expected, faster than her evaluation scores suggested, and she landed a hit on my left shoulder that was solid and real and sent a white flash through my vision that I filed away to deal with later. I dealt with Sana in the next 6 seconds. The forearms were exactly as predictable as the research said. His secondary arms initiated. I was already moving before his primary arms could override. Bricks favored his right side. I went left. He adjusted slower than his speed scores indicated he should, because speed in a straight line is not the same as speed in a lateral redirect when your dominant side instinct is pulling you the other direction. The fifth and final member of the squad was a Drathon named Corin, who I had less specific data on than the others, and he was, I will be honest, the most technically sound fighter of the group. He was careful. He did not rush. He moved with the kind of measured precision that suggested he had spent time thinking about me too, which I found genuinely interesting and almost made me want to ask him about it afterward. He did not yield before I reached him. He yielded when I reached him, and it was clean and without drama, which I also respected. I stood in the center of the floor. All 5 opponents were at the boundary or on the floor. Recovering, the sensor array was still running. I could see the numbers accumulating on the scoring display too. My right, I looked at Commander VCO. He was looking at the scoring display, then at me, then at the display again. His face was the face of a person doing a rapid and uncomfortable revision of a conclusion they had held with great confidence for a long time. Total elapsed time 6 minutes and 38 seconds. The observation area was still silent. Then from somewhere in the back, a single sound. Not cheering, not laughter, just one sharp, involuntary sound from someone who had not expected what they saw and could not quite contain the response. It was the truest sound in the room, and I heard it very clearly. I stepped off the floor, picked up my bag from the bench where I had left it, and walked toward the exit. My shoulder was generating a specific and insistent signal that I intended to address in the medical bay before anything else. My ribs on the left side had a complaint of their own that I noted but ranked as secondary. Cadet Theon was standing near the exit. He looked at me as I passed, that same look from the mess hall, but clearer now, like something that had been slightly out of focus had finally sharpened. I nodded at him, same as the night before, neutral, respectful, honest. I pushed open the door and walked out into the corridor, and the sound of the arena faded behind me, and ahead of me was the medical bay, and then after that, whatever came next. Medical officer on duty was Avani, named Pell, small for her species and efficient in a way that felt almost aggressive. She ran the diagnostic scanner over my torso, checked the results, ran it again, and then looked at me with an expression that I was becoming familiar with, the expression of someone recalibrating. 3 fractured ribs, she said. Left shoulder dislocated, soft tissue bruising across the left scapular region, consistent with significant impact. She paused. You completed the match with these injuries? Yes. She made a note in her record. Then she made another note. Then she said, without looking up, how long were you aware of the shoulder from the third exchange? She put down her stylus. That is 6 minutes of functional combat with a dislocated shoulder. 4 minutes and 11 seconds from the point of injury to match completion. She looked at me for a long moment. Does that hurt? Yes, but you continued. I had a plan. The plan required continuation. Pell was quiet for a moment. She had the forearmed stillness of a Ravani at rest, all her limbs relaxed and symmetrical. Then she said, I am going to treat your injuries now, and she said it in the tone of someone who has decided not to ask any more questions, because the answers are doing something unexpected to her understanding of the world. The treatment took 40 minutes. The rib fractures were addressed with the standard bone bonding compound the Academy used for combat injuries. Thick paste applied via pressurized injector that accelerated the natural calcification process. The shoulder was reset manually, which was the least pleasant 40 seconds of the morning by a significant margin, and then fitted with a stabilizing wrap that would hold the joint in correct alignment for 72 hours. I dressed, thanked Pell, and stepped into the corridor. Commander VKA was waiting outside. He was standing in the exact center of the corridor, hands at his sides, in the posture of a person who has decided that whatever they are about to say needs to be said standing up straight. He looked at me for a moment before speaking, and I let him take that moment because it seemed important to him. My office, he said. His office was 3 corridors away, a small room with a desk, a single window looking out at the star-scattered dark of the belt, and a wall display currently showing the arena sensor data from the morning. He sat behind the desk. I sat in the chair across from him. Between us on the display, the numbers from the match ran in a slow scroll. What enhancement were you using? He asked. None. Cadet Voss. None, I said again. Not with force just with the factual certainty of something that is simply true. The academy ran my intake bioscans on arrival and again at the 6-month review. The results are on file. I have no enhancement technology, no biological modification, no external augmentation of any kind. Verka was quiet. He looked at the display. He looked at me, then explained to me, he said, and something in his voice had shifted, something I had not expected from him, something that was very close to genuine, unguarded curiosity. How you map them, I told him. Not everything, not in exhaustive detail, but the structure of it, the archive research, the observation logs, the pressure point identification, the months of precision training in the lower bay at hours when no one was watching. I told him about my grandmother briefly because she was the origin of the approach, and it would not have made sense without her. Verka listened without interrupting. This was notable because in every classroom session I had observed him in, he interrupted frequently, not rudely but reflexively, the way people interrupt when they are already composing their response before you finish speaking. He did not do that now. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. You studied their bodies, he said. I studied the research that was already publicly available on their species. Anyone in the academy could access it. I simply read it with a specific question in mind. What question? Where does the system fail? He looked at the display. Again, the sensor data showed the moment of the first exchange, Keldron going down, and the numbers beside it: force supplied, angle, duration of effect, 42 kg. Verka said, reading the number from the display. 43 in the match. My training average was 42. He leaned back in his chair slowly, and the posture that had been military rigid since the corridor softened by a degree that was small but visible. He looked, for the first time since I had known him, like a person thinking rather than a person concluding. Drathons train for strength, he said. And it was not directed at me. It was directed at the wall or the window or some internal model he was revising. We always have. The logic is sound. Superior force wins engagements. Superior force protects. He paused. We train for the moment of engagement. We do not train for the aftermath of losing. That moment, I did not feel the silence. It was his thought, and it needed his space. You train for the aftermath, he said. I trained for the environment I was actually in. I said, I cannot be the strongest person in this cohort. I cannot be the fastest. I cannot match most of the biological advantages in that arena on a direct comparison, but I can be the most prepared. I can make the information I have more precise and more complete than anyone else's, and precision applied correctly doesn't to be the biggest force in the room. Verka looked at me for a long time after that. I held the look without flinching or performing, just honest and still. Cadet Voss, he said finally when I made the comment about 60 seconds yesterday. I was not being malicious. I know I was simply reporting what every available metric suggested. I know that too. The metrics were wrong. The metrics were accurate. I said they were measuring the correct values. They just weren't measuring the relevant ones. That stopped him. He looked at the display again, then back at me, and something moved across his face that I filed carefully in my observations, because it was rare and worth remembering. It was the expression of a person who is genuinely intelligent, encountering an idea they have never held before and choosing against the friction of everything they have built, their certainty on to let it in. Meeting ended shortly after, he told me. My performance had been logged and would affect my standing evaluation, and that the formal results would be processed through the standard channel. He did not say anything more than that, but when I stood to leave and reach the door, he said my name once more, and I turned. The lower training bay, he said. Is that where you have been in the night hours? Yes, I thought the usage logs were equipment calibration errors. I signed in every time I said my name is in the log. He nodded slowly. I did not look, he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it that was not quite an apology, but was adjacent to one, close enough that I received it in the spirit it was offered. Thank you, Commander, I said, and I meant it. Plainly, I walked out into the corridor. Late afternoon on the station, the light in the corridors had shifted to the amber orange of the pre-evening cycle. The halls were filling with cadets, moving between sessions and the mess hall, the normal density of a station. Day winding toward its quieter hours. No one looked at me differently in the corridor, not yet. That would come later. Or it would not, and either way it was not the point. I was 2 turns from my quarters when I heard footsteps behind me, deliberate and slightly hesitant, which was an unusual combination. I turned. Cadron was standing 6 paces back, no squad, no performance, just him, in the informal clothes cadets wore outside of sessions, looking like someone who had rehearsed something and was now not sure it was right. I waited. That move, he said, the first one, the knee. Yes, I have been in matches since I was 8 years old. He said, no one has ever put me on the floor with that. He said it factually, without drama, just reporting. The technique is in the Confederation Medical Archive, I said. Under Saurian Skeletal Anatomy, Volume 4, Chapter 11. He stared at me. You read the medical archive? I read everything I could find. He was quiet for a moment, then, why did you not say anything afterward in the arena? You could have. He paused. The room was watching. I thought about how to say the next thing in a way that was true without being condescending, because I was not there to make a point to the room. I said I was there because you needed to learn something, and so did I, and I did not need an audience for either of those things to matter. Keldrin was quiet for long enough that I thought the conversation had ended. Then he said, what did you need to learn? Whether the preparation was real, I said. Whether everything I had built in those training sessions actually worked when the situation was real. I knew it in theory. I needed to know it in practice. You gave me that. He absorbed this with the careful expression of someone hearing something they did not expect and are not sure what to do with yet. Then he nodded once slowly, the kind of nod that is not agreement but acknowledgement, which is sometimes more valuable. He walked away. I watched him go, and I thought that he was a genuinely capable person who had simply never had a reason to look past the surface of things, because the surface had always been enough for him. That was not a character flaw, it was a circumstance. Circumstances could change. I went to my quarters. I sat at my desk and opened my log and wrote the entry for the day, not the match details. Those were already in the sensor record. I wrote the things the sensors had not captured. Verka's expression when he said the metrics were accurate but not relevant, and the half-second pause before he agreed. Run in the corridor without his squad. Asking honest questions, Pell in the medical bay making additional notes she had not planned to make, small shifts, the kind that do not look like much from the outside but that I had learned from a long time of paying careful attention, were often where everything important actually happened. I closed the log. Outside my small window, the station's night cycle was beginning, the overhead strips dimming to blue, the stars in the belt going from background to foreground. As the interior light faded, I thought about the mission request sitting in my inbox that I had not yet opened. I had noticed it arrived during the afternoon session, flagged with a Confederation High Command header that I had never seen on a message addressed to a cadet. I had not opened it in the session because I did not want to read something that significant while I was still managing the physical output of the morning. I wanted to be rested. I wanted to be clear. I opened it now. It was brief, 4 sentences and a rank designation. The rank listed at the bottom was not cadet. I read it twice, then I sat back in my chair and looked out at the stars. My grandmother's voice came to me as it always did when something shifted. Not her advice, just her presence, the particular quality of her stillness when she knew something important was happening and she was letting it arrive at its own pace without rushing it. I had spent 14 months on this station, being measured by instruments that could not find me. I had spent those months building something in the dark, alone, at hours when no one was watching, with no guarantee that any of it would ever matter to anyone except myself. It had mattered. The message sat open on my desk. Outside, the stars were exactly where they had always been. Inside, something that had been waiting for a very long time was done waiting. I wrote one line in my log before I went to sleep. They call me the weakest. They were measuring the wrong things. Then I closed the log, set my alarm, and let the night cycle carry me into whatever came next. It was going to be significant. I was ready. The message was still on my screen when I woke up. I had not closed it the night before, and in the pale blue of the station's early morning cycle, it glowed with a quiet, steady insistence that I found appropriate. Important things should not be easy to look away from. I read it a third time, then a fourth. The Confederation High Command header was real. I had verified it against the official formatting database in the archive before I slept, because I am the kind of person who verifies things even when I already believe them. The header was genuine. The sender's identification code matched the active roster for the Joint Strategic Development Office, which was a division I had read about in the Confederation organizational documents, but had never expected to encounter personally. The message was short, as I had noted, but short does not mean simple. It said that my performance record, including the full sensor data from that morning's arena match, had been flagged by an automated monitoring system that the Joint Strategic Development Office ran across all Confederation Academy installations. The system was designed to identify cadets who demonstrated what the message called non-standard tactical reasoning, which was a careful phrase that I turned over in my mind for a while. Non-standard, not exceptional in the traditional sense, not highest scores or fastest times or greatest physical output. Non-standard, outside the expected Pattern, a deviation from the norm. I was a deviation from the norm. That had never been news to me, but apparently it was news to someone with a Confederation High Command header. The second paragraph said that a representative would arrive at the academy within 72 hours to conduct a personal evaluation. Interview. I was asked to confirm my availability. The third paragraph reminded me that this communication was classified at the station commander level and should not be discussed with other cadets. The fourth paragraph listed the rank, not cadet, not any of the standard academy progression ranks that I had memorized during my first week on the station. The rank listed was a provisional field designation that I had only ever seen in historical documents, a rank that the Confederation had used during the outer expansion period for individuals who were assigned to missions where standard rank structures did not apply because the situation did not fit into standard structures. I sent the confirmation, brief, direct. No performance. I was available. I would be present. Then I closed the message, put on my training clothes, and went to the lower bay. The session that morning began differently than any before it. I was aware of it the moment I walked into the main hall. 41 cadets had been in that observation area yesterday. 41 cadets had seen the sensor data, had watched every exchange, had been in the room when the final numbers appeared on the display. Word travels on a station at the speed of people who have something interesting to say, and what they had seen was interesting by any standard. No one laughed when I entered. That was the difference. It was not that they cheered or parted or made any dramatic display. It was simply that the laughter was gone, and in its absence, the room felt different in the way room feels different when a persistent background noise you have stopped noticing finally goes quiet. The quality of silence changed. Commander Vrethka ran the session with his usual efficiency. He did not refer to the match. He did not make any direct comment about me, but in the structure of the session, in the way assignments were distributed and partners were paired, something had shifted in the underlying logic of his decisions. I was no longer the control subject. I was no longer the baseline reference. I was in the session the way every other cadet was in the session, as a participant with a record that was now officially part of the actual data. My shoulder ached through the morning drills. The rib fractures were managed but present. I worked within the limits the injury set and did not push past them, because working within real limits is not defeat, it is intelligence. And my grandmother had taught me the difference between discomfort that protects and discomfort that destroys. I knew where that line was. Cadet Theon ended up beside me during the paired observation exercise in the second half of the session. The exercise required 2 cadets to watch a recorded combat sequence and independently identify tactical errors. We sat at adjacent terminals, separate task but close enough for conversation. He did not speak immediately. I had noted over the months that Theon was not a person who spoke before he was ready, which I found respectable. He was working through his own observation log, his forearms moving with that Ivani economy of motion, neat and small. After about 10 minutes, he said without looking up from his terminal, "You ate alone every evening?" It was not a question. I treated it as what it was, an observation offered as a starting point. "Yes," I said, I thought at first it was because you preferred it, he said. I did prefer it, I said. It was easier to think. He was quiet again. Then I watched you in the mess hall. Sometimes I know that sounds strange. It doesn't sound strange. You were trying to understand something. He finally looked at me. Irani eyes were large relative to the face, and they had a quality of stillness that could read as either calm or judgment, depending on context. In Theon it was calm. I had decided that early. I was trying to understand how you were not more affected by it, he said. The things they said, the way the board showed your numbers every session. If it were me, he stopped. I would not have been able to sit quietly. I was not sitting quietly on the inside, I said, but on the outside. On the outside I was managing information. If I respond to mockery, I give the person making it useful data about how to affect me. If I do not respond, I give them nothing. I paused. It is not natural for me. It is a choice I make every time. Sometimes are easier than others. The considered this, one of his secondary arms moved in the small circular pattern I had come to recognize as his equivalent of a thinking gesture. Humans choose a great deal, he said, not critically, more as if the idea were new and interesting, more than most species I have studied. Your biology gives you fewer instinctive frameworks. You have to build more of your responses consciously. That is one way to describe it, I said. Another way is that we have fewer locked patterns. If the instinct does not apply, we are not bound to it, but that means you carry more, he said. You have to hold everything yourself. Yes, I said, we do. He went back to his terminal. I went back to mine, but the silence between us was different from the silence of two people who are not speaking. It was the silence of two people who have said something true and are giving it room to settle. At the end of the session, he said, I want to train with you if you are willing. I looked at him. Why? Because I think you see things I am missing, he said, and because you are honest about what you know and what you do not know, and I find that useful. Tomorrow morning, I said. Lower Bay 500. He agreed without hesitation, which told me he had already decided before asking and had only been waiting to confirm. That kind of intentionality I respected. I left the session and spent the afternoon in the archive, not combat research this time. I pulled the classified portion of the Joint Strategic Development Office public records, everything that was available without security clearance, which was not much but was something. I read for 3 hours. I built a structural map of what the office did, what kinds of engagements it handled, what kinds of people it historically recruited, and why. The picture that emerged was not comfortable exactly, but it was coherent. The office worked in situations that fell outside standard engagement doctrine, situations where the standard toolkit was not sufficient, where the gap between what existed and what was needed was too wide for conventional approaches. They needed people who could work in that gap. Non-standard tactical reasoning. I thought about my grandmother again, about the hospital she had worked in, the cases no one else wanted to take, the patients who had been through every standard protocol without result. She had never been afraid of the unusual case. She had been drawn to it. She had told me once sitting in her kitchen that the unusual case was where the real learning was. The standard cases teach you the protocols, she said. the unusual. Cases teach you how to think. I had spent 17 years being an unusual case. I closed the archive, walked to the mess hall and ate dinner, not alone this time because Theon was there, and he sat down across from me without asking, which I had not expected, but found I did not mind. We did not talk much. That was fine. Presence is its own kind of communication, and what it communicated in this case was something simple and solid. You are not invisible. I had known I was not invisible, but it was different to have it said without words from a direction I had not anticipated. The next 2 days passed with the deliberate pace of things that are moving towards something without rushing. VTHA sessions continued. The trained with me in the mornings and had better instincts than his evaluation scores suggested, which made me curious about whether the measurement problem was more widespread than I had originally considered. Caldron nodded at me once in the corridor, a small deliberate acknowledgement that meant something without requiring an explanation. On the morning of the 72nd hour, a shuttle docked at the Academy's secondary bay. I knew because the station-wide arrival notification system listed it as a joint strategic development office transport, and I had set an alert for that specific designation. The morning I received the message, I was in my quarters, dressed, prepared. The representative was a woman named Helen Marsh. She was human, which I had not specifically expected. She was perhaps 50, with the calm, precise manner of someone who had been in important rooms for a long time and had decided that the most useful thing you could project in those rooms was absolute steadiness. She wore Confederation officer's uniform with a rank insignia I had to look up to identify because it was 3 tiers above anything I had seen on the station. She came to me rather than summoning me to a formal meeting space. She knocked on my quarters door. I opened it. She looked at me with the direct, assessing attention of someone who had reviewed my file thoroughly and was now comparing the file to the person. Whatever the comparison produced, she did not show it on her face. Cadet Voss, she said, I have read your sensor record. I have also read your training logs, your archive access history, and your academic file. I would like to talk. Yes, I said, please come in. The conversation lasted 2 hours. I will not record all of it here because some of what she told me was given with the understanding that it would stay in this room, but the shape of it was this. The Confederation had for some time been confronting a specific kind of problem in its outer systems, situations that required not the strongest available response but the most adaptive one, situations where sending the most physically capable forces was the wrong answer because the variables were too complex and too unpredictable for pure force to navigate. They had been looking for something different. We do not typically recruit at cadet level. Marsh said the standard path is active officer with a minimum of 3 years field experience, but your record is not following a standard path. No, I said. What do you understand about the provisional field designation in the message I sent you? I told her what I had found in the historical records. She listened with the same quality of attention she had brought to everything. Complete and genuine. That is accurate. She said, what it means in practical terms is that you would operate with a degree of autonomy that standard rank structures do not accommodate. You would be assigned to a team, but your role Within that team would be assessed and adjusted based on the specific demands of each engagement, not on a fixed position. She paused. This is not a comfortable way to work. It requires a tolerance for uncertainty that most people, regardless of species, find difficult. I have been the last ranked cadet in a cohort of 44 for 14 months. I said I have trained alone at 4 in the morning in a building where no one knew I was there, with no guarantee that any of it would ever produce a result that anyone else would ever see. I have some familiarity with uncertainty. Marsh was quiet for a moment, then something happened on her face that was very small but entirely genuine. It was not exactly a smile, it was the expression of a person who has been looking for something specific for a long time and has just found it in an unexpected place. Yes, she said, I believe you do. She left later that afternoon. The formal confirmation would come through official channels within the week. She told me to continue my sessions, continue my training, and to be ready to leave when the confirmation arrived, because when it arrived, it would likely come with a departure window measured in hours, not days. I thanked her. She nodded, picked up her case, and walked back toward the secondary bay with the unhurried certainty of a person who had done exactly what she came to do. I went to the lower training bay. It was midday, not my usual hour, and the lights were set to full brightness. The room was empty. I stood in the center of it for a moment, the way you stand in a place that has meant something to you when you know you are going to leave it. 14 months of mornings in this room. The smell of composite flooring and equipment cleaner, the hum of the processors in the walls, the practice dummies at Saurian resistance calibration, still set to the setting I had requested 7 months ago, and no one had changed because no one else used them. I ran my sequence, precise, controlled, full rotation from the shoulder. Despite the wrap, the ribs announced themselves clearly at certain angles, and I acknowledged them and continued. I ran the sequence from beginning to end, all 32 movements, the way I had run it every day for most of a year. Then I stood in the center of the room and thought about where I was going. I did not know the specifics. I knew the framework. I knew the kind of work. I knew that it would require everything I had built here, and probably more than that, things I had not built yet and would need to build as I went in real conditions, without the safety of a training bay and a predictable drill sequence. That was all right. I was not afraid of real conditions. I was, if I was honest with myself, in the way I always tried to be, something closer to ready, not the readiness of a person who has no more to learn, the readiness of a person who has learned enough to know how to keep learning. That was the only kind of readiness that had ever been worth having. I picked up my bag and turned off the training bay light on my way out. In the corridor, I passed 2 Drathian cadets from the year above me, who nodded as I went by. The kind of nod that has some weight behind it. I noticed it. I did not let it change my pace or my expression, but I filed it because I filed everything, and because the nod was data too. Things were different now. I had not changed. Facts around me had changed, and those facts included other people's understanding of what the facts were. That was not nothing. That was actually something quite significant, and I wanted to receive it clearly rather than either dismissing it or leaning on it too hard. I went to the mess hall for dinner. The was already there, so unexpectedly was. Khan sitting 2 tables away alone with the expression of someone who is getting comfortable with something new and has not yet decided how to wear it. I got my food, I considered, then I walked to his table. He looked up. May I asked. He was quiet for a moment, then he moved his tray slightly to the side in the way that on a station where personal space is a real and considered thing means yes. Without requiring the word, I sat down. We ate without speaking for a while. It was not uncomfortable, it was the silence of 2 people who have already said the things that needed to be said, and are now simply present in the same space, which is sometimes all that is needed. Eventually he said, the Medical Archive, Volume 4, Chapter 11. I said. He nodded slowly. I'm going to read it. It is good reading, I said. He looked at me with something that was not quite humor, but lived in the same neighborhood. I imagine it is more useful from your side of the situation. Everything is more useful when you know it than when you do not, I said. He considered that, then he picked up his food again and we ate the rest of the meal in the kind of quiet that had changed quality from the start of it to the end of it in a way that both of us could feel, and neither of us needed to name. My personal log, final entry from the academy. I am writing this in my quarters on the last evening before departure. The confirmation came through this morning, as Marsh had said it would, with a departure window listed in hours. My window is 14 hours from now. I have packed what I need. It is not much. I travel light. This was always true and has become more true over the past year. I want to record the things that happened and what I think they mean, while they are still close enough to see clearly. The first thing I want to record is this: I was not the weakest cadet in this cohort. I was the cadet whose strengths were invisible to the instruments being used to measure them. That is a different thing. It is worth saying precisely because the difference matters. There is a version of this story that I could tell as a story about proving people wrong, about standing in the center of that arena and making every person who ever laughed watch their certainty fall apart. I understand why that version is satisfying. I have felt the satisfaction of it, but I do not think it is the true version, or at least not the most useful one. The true version is this: I built something for 14 months alone in the dark with no audience and no guarantee. I built skill and a system and a way of thinking that I could actually use. I built it not to impress anyone, but because not building it was not something I could accept. Something in me would not let the work stay undone just because no one was watching. I learned that from my grandmother, or maybe I learned it alongside her, because some things you learn from watching more than from being told. She never needed an audience for her work to mean something. She needed the work to be done correctly and for the patient on the table to still be breathing when she finished. The rest was secondary. The second thing I want to record is about the measurement problem. Every system uses instruments. Every institution, every culture, every species I have encountered on this station runs its assessments through instruments of some kind, and instruments are built by people, and people build them to measure the things they already understand. This means that every instrument has a built-in gap. The things it was not built to measure, I was in that gap. My strengths, the preparation, the precision, the pain tolerance, the willingness to keep Thinking when everything hurts, none of those appeared on the standard assessment board because the board was built by people who understood combat in terms of the variables they had always used: strength, speed, biological capacity. The board was accurate. The board was just looking at the wrong shelf. I do not say this to criticize the people who built the board. Vreka is a genuinely capable officer and a better teacher than his certainty sometimes allows him to be. The measurement systems here are well made for what they were made to do. The limitation is not malice, it is the structural reality that every instrument has a horizon, and what exists beyond that horizon is real, even when the instrument cannot find it. The practical lesson from this is simple: if you are being measured and the measurement says you are nothing, the first question is not how do I become something. The first question is, what is this instrument unable to see? Because the answer to that question is where you actually live. The third thing I want to record is about Theon. We trained together for 3 mornings. In those 3 mornings I learned that Theon has a lateral awareness that no instrument I have seen on the station would know how to score, a spatial comprehension that comes from having 4 arms and a brain that evolved to manage them simultaneously, which means he can track positional data in a way that I genuinely cannot replicate. I learned something from him. This was not something I expected. I had come into this station assuming I would be learning from the structured curriculum and from my own research, and both of those things were true, but the unexpected learning, the learning that came from actually knowing another person in a real way, was different in quality from both. When I told him I was leaving, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I want to ask you something and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is no. I said that I would. He asked if I thought he should consider the combat track. I thought about it seriously for a moment because he deserved a serious answer. Then I told him yes, but not for the same reasons anyone else would recommend it, not because his evaluation scores were high, not because his forearmed capacity made him physically formidable, though it did, but because I had watched him in 3 training sessions make adjustments in real time that most cadets took months to learn, and because the quality of his attention was exceptional, and because he asked honest questions and received honest answers without flinching from either. He nodded in the way I had come to recognize as his version of receiving something important. Will you write to me? He asked. When I can, I said. The assignment may have restrictions on communication, but when I can, that is enough, he said, and it was exactly enough. Some things do not need to be more than they are to be real. The 4th thing I want to record is about Khan. He came to find me this afternoon, not at my quarters, but at the archive, where I was returning the last physical reference volume I had borrowed. He found me in the return corridor, and he was carrying something, a small data chip, the kind used for personal file transfers. He held it out. My training records, he said, from the last 2 years: technique, breakdowns, response pattern analysis, everything my coaches gave me. He paused. I thought it might be useful to you for the assignment. I looked at the chip, then at him. Why? I asked. He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him working through how to say the thing correctly. Because I was wrong, he said. Finally, about what you were. I was wrong in a way that I should not have been because I had eyes and I chose not to use them, and I think the least I can do is make sure that mistake does not cost you something you needed to have. I took the chip. Thank you, I said. He nodded, started to leave, then stopped. Half turned. The assignment, he said, is it difficult? Probably, I said. Will you be ready? I thought about that for one honest second. Yes, I said. He looked at me, and this time there was something in his expression that I had not seen there before. Not admiration exactly, though. It was adjacent to that, something more straightforward, something like simple, genuine conviction. I believe you, he said. He walked away. I stood in the archive corridor with the data chip in my hand and the quiet of the late afternoon around me, and thought about the distance between the morning he walked into that hall expecting a demonstration and this moment where a chip containing 2 years of his most careful work sat in my palm as a gift. That distance was not large in terms of days. In terms of what had moved, it was significant. I put the chip in my bag. Back in my quarters, I finished packing. I sat at my desk for a while, not doing anything in particular, just letting the room be a room while it still was. The window with its view of the belt, the small shelf where I kept the 3 books I had carried from home, physical books, paper and ink, because my grandmother kept physical books and I had inherited the habit along with everything else she gave me. I took the books down and packed them last carefully, the way you pack things that have traveled with you long enough to mean something. 14 months, last place on the board. The laughter I had trained myself not to respond to. The lower bay at 4 in the morning, the archive at midnight. The careful, patient accumulation of precision over power, knowledge over assumption, preparation over hope. It had been enough, more than enough. It had been exactly the right kind of work, for exactly the right kind of person in exactly the right kind of situation, which meant that all of it, including the parts that were hard and the parts that were lonely and the parts where I was not sure any of it would ever matter, had been leading somewhere real. I thought about what Marsh had said about the work ahead, the outer systems, the gaps in standard doctrine, the situations that needed a different kind of thinking. I thought about my grandmother's hands moving in that kitchen, making the hard things look easy, not because they were easy, but because she had done the work before anyone was watching. I thought about the kid who had sat last on a ranking board for 14 months and trained in the dark and read the medical archive and mapped the failure points and waited patiently and without drama for the moment when the preparation would meet the situation. The moment had come, and the one after it was coming. I was ready for both. I wrote the last line of this entry, and then I closed the log for the last time. As a cadet, in 14 hours I would walk off the station as something else. I did not know everything that meant yet. I knew enough that had always been enough to begin.